Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at something that I know a lot of you are really interested in. And, we've gotten a lot of great feedback on and questions about it from you guys, and that is English fluency. We're going to be looking at a clip today from a podcast called The English Fluency Blueprint. And the hosts are Emma and Jake.
Okay.
And they have a really interesting take on it. They're all about helping people become confident English speakers. And I think you're really going to like what they have to say. And so we're going to sort of go through and unpack some of their main points. And then, of course, bring in our own perspective and try to, give you some actionable takeaways. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting that they said, and this is something we've kind of touched on before in other deep dives, is that fluency isn't really about perfection. It's more about confidence and effective communication. I thought that was a really great way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So what did you think about that when you first heard them say that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so true, right? Because I think so many times when people think about fluency, they think about, like speaking perfectly and not making any mistakes and, having this huge vocabulary. But actually, I think the most important thing is being able to communicate your ideas effectively and doing it in a way that, you feel confident and comfortable.
Exactly. And I think that, like you were saying, a lot of times people get really hung up on the grammar and making sure that every sentence is perfectly correct. And that can really hold you back.
Yeah, it can definitely make you afraid to speak if you're too worried about making mistakes.
Absolutely. So I think that's a really good point that they make. And it's something to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this deep dive. Another thing that they talked about that I thought was really interesting is the idea that there are these roadblocks to fluency. And they identified three main ones. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on these as well. But they said it's fear of making mistakes, traditional teaching methods that prioritize grammar over practical conversation, and then just a lack of real-world practice.
Yeah, I think those are some of the biggest ones for sure.
Yeah.
I think, especially the fear of making mistakes. I think that's something that a lot of learners struggle with.
Right.
And it can really prevent them from, making progress.
Yeah.
Because if you're constantly worried about making mistakes, you're never going to want to speak.
You're not going to want to put yourself out there.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the traditional teaching methods, I think that's also a really big one because so much of the traditional language teaching is focused on grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary lists and things like that, which is important, but it's not the only thing.
Right. It's not enough.
Right.
You have to actually use the language. You have to use it. Yeah. And you have to use it in a way that's meaningful to you. So I think those are really valid points that they bring up. Now, thinking about your own experiences with language learning, which of those roadblocks do you think has been the biggest one for you personally?
I would say probably the lack of real world practice.
Okay.
I've studied languages in school and I've done all the traditional stuff, but I think the biggest difference for me came when I actually started using the language in real life situations, traveling to a country where the language is spoken, or even just finding opportunities to speak with native speakers online or in my local community. That's when I really started to feel like I was making progress.
Yeah. It's like all of a sudden it clicks, It's not just theoretical anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, like you're actually using it for a purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference. Absolutely. So I think that's a really good point. And I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads into what they talked about next, which is the practical tips for overcoming these roadblocks. And they had a whole bunch of great tips.
Yeah, they did.
But some of the ones that stood out to me were things like thinking in English, practicing speaking daily, even if it's just with yourself, listening to native speakers as much as possible, embracing mistakes as learning opportunities, and finding a language partner. So what are your thoughts on those tips?
Well, I think they're all really good tips. And I think they all kind of go back to that idea of immersion that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
It's about creating an environment where you're constantly exposed to the language and you're constantly using it. So, even if you can't travel to an English-speaking country, you can still create that immersive environment for yourself by, watching English language movies and TV shows, listening to English language music and podcasts, reading English language books and articles. All of those things can help you to get more exposure to the language.
Yeah.
And start to internalize the sounds and the rhythms and the grammar.
Right. It's like you're training your ear and your brain
exactly.
to get used to the language.
Yeah.
One of the tips that they mentioned that I thought was really interesting, and this is something that we talked about on the show before too, is the idea of recording yourself speaking English.
Oh, yeah.
And then listening back to it. And I know that can be a little bit awkward.
Yeah.
And even a little bit painful sometimes to listen to your own voice.
Yeah.
But I think it's actually a really valuable exercise.
It is.
Because it allows you to hear yourself the way that other people hear you.
Yeah.
And you can start to identify areas where you might need to improve.
Exactly. And you can also, it can be really encouraging to hear yourself make progress over time. If you record yourself every few weeks or every few months, you can really start to see how much you're improving.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes it's hard to notice your own progress when you're so focused on, just getting the words out.
Right.
But when you can actually listen back to yourself and hear the difference, that can be really motivating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's a great tip, and I encourage everyone to try it, even if it's just for a few minutes. So we've talked about the importance of communication and confidence, and we've talked about some of the roadblocks to fluency and some practical tips for overcoming them. Now, Emma and Jake also talked about the role of confidence in achieving fluency. And they see confidence as being a key ingredient, not just a byproduct of becoming fluent.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's so true because, a lot of times people think like, oh, I'll be confident when I'm fluent. But I actually think it's the other way around. You have to have confidence in yourself in order to be able to speak fluently.
Right.
Because if you're not confident, you're going to be hesitant. You're going to be afraid to make mistakes. And you're not going to be able to really express yourself.
You're going to hold yourself back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to focus on building your confidence from the very beginning of your language learning journey.
And it makes me think about other things that I've learned in my life. Whether it's like playing a musical instrument or learning a new sport or even just, learning how to cook. Like the more you practice, the more confident you become.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the more confident you become, the more you're willing to push yourself and try new things. So it's really a positive cycle.
It is. Confidence breeds confidence.
Confidence breeds confidence, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you think people can build their confidence?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of different ways. I think one important thing is to set realistic goals.
Okay.
Don't try to do too much too soon. Just focus on making small improvements each day.
Small steps, yeah.
Yeah. And then I think it's also important to find a supportive learning environment where you feel comfortable making mistakes.
Yeah.
And where you're not afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Because if you're constantly feeling judged or criticized, that's going to really damage your confidence.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
So it's important to find people who are going to be encouraging and supportive.
And people who are kind of on the same journey as you.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can kind of learn from each other and support each other. All right, so we've talked about the importance of communication and confidence. And we've talked about some of the roadblocks to fluency and some practical tips for overcoming them. Now, one of the things that I really appreciated about Emma and Jake's approach is that they also spent some time debunking some common myths about language learning.
Oh, yeah, I love that part.
Yeah, I thought that was really valuable because there's so much misinformation out there.
There is.
And it can be really discouraging for learners. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the myths that they debunked.
Yeah.
So the first one that they talked about is the myth that you need to live abroad to be fluent.
Right.
Now, I've heard that one so many times.
You too.
And I think it's just not true.
It's not.
I mean, obviously, living abroad can be a great way to immerse yourself in the language, and it can definitely accelerate your learning. But it's not a requirement.
No.
There are plenty of people who have achieved fluency without ever setting foot in an English-speaking country.
Right. And I think nowadays, especially with the internet, you have access to so many resources.
Yeah.
You can find online language partners. You can watch English language movies and TV shows. You can listen to English language music and podcasts. Like, you don't have to live abroad to get that exposure to the language.
Right. And you can create your own little English-speaking world right here at home.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important myth to debunk because it can be really discouraging for people who, maybe don't have the opportunity to travel.
Yeah.
Or who are just starting out on their language learning journey. So what do you think about the myth that you need to have a massive vocabulary to be fluent?
I think that's another one that's just not true.
Yeah.
Obviously, vocabulary is important, but I think it's more important to be able to use the vocabulary that you do have effectively.
Right.
You don't need to know every word in the dictionary
Yeah.
to be able to communicate your ideas.
Exactly. And I think sometimes people get so caught up in trying to learn all these new words that they forget about the importance of just using the language and communicating.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to remember that even native speakers don't know every word in the dictionary.
Right.
There are always going to be words that you don't know. But that doesn't mean that you're not fluent.
Exactly. It just means that you're human.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's another really important myth to debunk, because it can be really overwhelming for learners to think that they need to learn all these words
It can be.
before they can even start speaking.
Yeah.
So the last myth that they talked about is the myth that fluent speakers never pause or hesitate.
Right.
Now, this one I think is particularly damaging.
Yeah, it is.
Because it sets up this unrealistic expectation that fluent speakers are just these perfect speaking machines.
Exactly.
Who never make any mistakes and never have to stop and think about what they're going to say.
And it's just not true.
It's not true at all.
Even native speakers pause and hesitate and, sometimes they even say, it's just part of natural speech.
Part of thinking, and processing.
Yeah.
And it's actually a good thing because it shows that you're thinking about what you're saying.
Right.
And you're trying to choose the right words.
Yep.
So, I think that's a really important myth to debunk because it can make learners feel really self-conscious about their pauses and hesitations.
Right.
And it can prevent them from speaking up and practicing.
It can make you afraid to speak.
Yeah. So it's important to remember that pauses and hesitations are a natural part of speech.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're nothing to be ashamed of.
Yeah. So those were just a few of the myths that Emma and Jake debunked. And I thought it was a really valuable exercise because it helps to clear up some of the misconceptions about language learning. And it can really empower learners to feel more confident.
Yeah.
And to keep going on their journey.
For sure.
So speaking of the journey, Emma and Jake wrapped up their podcast with a challenge. And I think it's a really great challenge. It's the 7-day challenge.
Okay.
And they challenge their listeners to commit to speaking English aloud for at least 10 minutes each day for a week.
Okay.
Now, that might not sound like a lot, but I think it's actually a really powerful exercise.
Yeah, I think so too.
Because it forces you to use the language.
Right. On a daily basis.
Yeah, consistency is key.
Consistency is key, exactly. And it gets you into the habit of speaking.
And it doesn't have to be anything fancy.
Right.
You can just talk to yourself. Or you can talk to your pet. Or you can
talk to a plant.
You can talk to a plant. It doesn't matter. The important thing is just to get those words out of your mouth.
Exactly.
And to get used to the sound of your own voice.
Yeah. And to start thinking in English.
Right.
Which is another really important part of becoming fluent.
It is.
So what are your thoughts on this 10-minute challenge?
I think it's a great idea. And I think it's something that anyone can do. It doesn't require a lot of time or effort, but it can make a big difference in your fluency.
So how do you think people can fit this challenge into their busy lives?
Well, I think it's just about finding little pockets of time throughout the day. Maybe you can speak English for a few minutes while you're getting ready in the morning, or while you're cooking dinner, or while you're taking a walk. There are always little opportunities if you just look for them.
Yeah. It's all about being intentional about it.
Exactly. Or being creative.
Yeah. And not being afraid to just speak.
Yeah.
Even if you're by yourself.
Right. And even if you make mistakes.
Exactly.
Because that's how you learn.
That's how you learn.
Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about a lot of great stuff today. We've talked about the importance of communication and confidence. We've talked about some of the roadblocks to fluency and some practical tips for overcoming them. We've debunked some common myths about language learning. And we've talked about the 7-day challenge. So what's the one key takeaway that you'd like to leave our listener with today?
I would say the most important thing is just to keep going.
Okay.
Don't give up on your dream of becoming fluent. It's achievable.
Yeah.
And it's worth it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to remember that fluency is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
So just enjoy the process.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly.
All right, well, this has been a really fun deep dive, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah, I have.
I know I have. So we'll be back soon with another deep dive. But until then, happy learning.
Yeah, happy learning.
Emma and Jake also talk about the importance of building confidence as you progress on your fluency journey. They see it as a key ingredient, not just a byproduct of becoming fluent.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is that they don't just say, like, oh, just be more confident,
Yeah.
They actually give you, like, a roadmap for how to build that confidence.
Okay.
So they talk about things like, setting realistic goals and, focusing on making small improvements each day.
Yeah.
And finding a supportive learning environment. And all of these things can help you to gradually build your confidence over time.
So it's not like something that just happens overnight.
Right. It's a process.
It's a process.
Yeah.
And it takes time and effort, but it's definitely achievable.
And it's so worth it because when you have confidence, you're not afraid to make mistakes. And you're more willing to put yourself out there and practice.
And I think that's when the real learning happens.
Exactly.
When you're not afraid to make mistakes and you're willing to just kind of go for it.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I think confidence is kind of like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Okay.
So the more you practice speaking English, even if you're making mistakes, the more confident you're going to become.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like anything else you know.
Yeah.
The more you do it, the better you get at it.
Exactly.
And the more confident you become.
Yeah.
So, thinking about other things that you've learned in your life, like maybe playing a musical instrument or learning a new sport.
Yeah.
Or even just like learning a new skill. Like, how did you build your confidence in those areas?
Well, I think for me, it was just about practice, practice, practice. The more I practiced, the better I got. And the more confident I became.
And did you have like a supportive environment?
Yeah, I think that's really important too. Having people around you who are encouraging and who believe in you can make a big difference.
Because I think sometimes when you're first starting out, it's easy to get discouraged if you don't have people around you who are supporting you.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I think it's really important to find those people and to create that kind of positive learning environment for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about the importance of communication and confidence. And we've talked about some of the roadblocks to fluency and some practical tips for overcoming them. Now, one of the things that I really appreciated about Emma and Jake's approach is that they also spend some time debunking some common myths about language learning.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I love when people do that.
Me too. Because I think there are so many myths out there.
There are.
That can really hold people back. So I'm curious, what are some of the myths that you've heard?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is that you need to live abroad to be fluent.
Yeah. That's a big one.
Which is just not true.
No, it's not true at all.
I mean, obviously, living abroad can be helpful.
Yeah.
But it's not necessary.
Right. You can achieve fluency without ever leaving your home country.
Exactly.
If you're willing to put in the effort.
Right. It's all about creating that immersive environment for yourself.
Exactly.
Wherever you are.
So another myth that I've heard a lot is that you need to have a massive vocabulary to be fluent.
Yeah, that's another big one.
And again, I think that's just not true.
No. I mean, obviously vocabulary is important.
Right.
But you don't need to know every single word in the dictionary.
Exactly.
To be able to communicate effectively.
And I think sometimes people get so caught up in trying to learn as many words as possible that they forget about the importance of just using the language and communicating.
And I think it's also important to remember that even native speakers don't know every word in the dictionary.
Right. Nobody knows every single word.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's a really important myth to debunk. Because it can be really overwhelming for learners to think that they need to learn all these words before they can even start speaking.
It can be very intimidating.
Yeah. So another myth that Emma and Jake debunked is the myth that fluent speakers never pause or hesitate.
Oh.
Now, I think this is a really damaging myth.
It is.
Because it sets up this unrealistic expectation that fluent speakers are these like perfect speaking machines who never make any mistakes and never have to stop and think about what they're going to say.
Yeah, and it just makes people feel bad about themselves
Yeah.
when they do pause or hesitate.
Exactly. And it can prevent them from speaking up and practicing.
Right.
Because they're afraid of making those mistakes.
Yeah. And it's just important to remember that pausing and hesitating is a natural part of speech. It's how we process information.
It's how we think.
Yeah.
So it's nothing to be ashamed of.
Exactly.
So yeah, those were just a few of the myths that Emma and Jake debunked. And I thought it was a really valuable part of their podcast.
Yeah.
Because I think it's so important to clear up these misconceptions.
Yeah.
about language learning.
It can be really freeing to let go of those myths.
So now that we've kind of debunked some of those myths, let's talk about what Emma and Jake suggested as a way to kind of put all of this into practice.
Okay.
So they ended their podcast with a challenge.
Okay.
And it's called the 7-Day Challenge.
Nice.
And they challenged their listeners to commit to speaking English aloud for at least 10 minutes each day for 7 days.
Oh, wow.
So for a whole week.
Okay.
Now, I know that might sound a little intimidating to some people, but I think it's a really great way to kind of to put all of this into practice.
Yeah, I think so too.
And to really make it a part of your daily routine.
Because consistency is so important.
Consistency is key.
Yeah. You know, if you just practice once in a while, it's not going to make a big difference.
Right.
But if you can make it a habit to speak English every day, even if it's just for 10 minutes, that's going to make a huge difference over time.
So what are your thoughts on this 10-minute challenge?
I think it's a great idea. And I think it's something that anyone can do. You know, it doesn't require a lot of time or special equipment.
Exactly.
You can do it anywhere, anytime. So there's really no excuse not to do it.
And I think it's a really good way to kind of to get over that fear of speaking.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
Because if you're speaking for 10 minutes every day, even if it's just to yourself, you're going to start to feel more comfortable with the language.
And you're going to start to make fewer mistakes.
Yeah.
And you're just going to become more fluent overall.
So how do you think people can fit this challenge into their busy lives?
Well, I think it's just about finding little pockets of time throughout the day. You know, maybe you can speak English while you're getting ready in the morning, or while you're cooking dinner, or while you're taking a walk, or even while you're driving in the car.
Yeah.
You know, there are always little opportunities if you just look for them.
It's all about being intentional about it.
Exactly, and making it a priority.
Yeah. So what are some other ways that people can kind of make this challenge their own?
Well, I think one way is to find a language partner.
Okay.
Someone who you can practice with. On a regular basis.
And that could be someone online or in person?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And, you know, it doesn't have to be a formal thing. It could just be a friend or a family member who's also learning English or who's a native speaker.
And you can just kind of chat with them for 10 minutes each day.
Exactly.
And you can talk about whatever you want.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't have to be anything specific, just as long as you're speaking English.
Exactly.
All right, so we've talked about the 7-Day Challenge and how people can fit it into their busy lives.
Yeah.
So what are some other ways that people can kind of make this challenge their own?
Well, I think one way is to set a specific goal for each day.
Okay.
You know, maybe one day you could focus on practicing your pronunciation.
Okay.
And another day you could focus on expanding your vocabulary.
Right.
And another day you could focus on improving your grammar.
It's kind of have like a theme for each day.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And I think another way to make the challenge more fun is to find a way to make it social.
Okay.
You know, maybe you could join an online language exchange group. Or you could start a conversation group with some friends.
And you could all do the challenge together.
Yeah.
And kind of support each other.
Exactly.
So those are just a few ideas. But I think the most important thing is to just find what works for you. And make it fun.
Yeah.
Because if you're not enjoying it, you're not going to stick with it.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's the key to success with this challenge.
I agree.
All right, so we've talked about the 7-Day Challenge and how people can fit it into their busy lives and all the different ways that you can kind of, you know, make it your own. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, what Emma and Jake are really trying to do is to help people to see that fluency is achievable.
Yeah.
And that it's not this like mysterious thing that only certain people can achieve.
It's really about putting in the effort and being consistent.
And having the right mindset.
Yeah.
You know,
having the right mindset.
I think that's a big part of it too.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that fluency is not a destination. It's a journey.
Right.
And it's a journey that you can enjoy.
Yeah.
You know, it's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about being able to communicate and connect with other people and express yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. And I think it's something that all of our listeners can take to heart.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.
It was my pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with another one. But until then,
happy learning,
everyone.